I thought I knew love until Jack was gone. Until the house we shared became a cold, lonely shell. Then I adopted Jerry, and the quiet companionship gave me a lifeline. But when memories of Jack turned darker, even sensual moments we once shared twisted into something else. Now the lines between love, grief, and fear blur as the house reveals its secrets. Will I uncover the truth before it's too late? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The house was too quiet. Every sound I made seemed to echo through the rooms, magnifying the silence. The kitchen table, Jack's favorite spot, stood untouched. He'd called it our place of plans, where we'd share morning coffee and dreams about the future. Now it was just another reminder of everything I'd lost. I ran my hand over its worn surface, tracing the scratches Jack had joked were battle scars of daily life. I wanted to feel his presence, but the wood was cold, unyielding. The weight in my chest grew heavier, like the house itself was pressing down on me. It had been a year since Jack died. A year of trying to navigate the endless void he left behind. Therapy sessions, gardening, book clubs, they all blurred together into a monotonous attempt to distract myself. Nothing worked. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, had become a hollow shell. I caught myself talking to Jack sometimes, imagining his voice answering back. Pathetic, right? But grief does strange things to a person. On a whim, I decided to visit the animal shelter. I don't even remember getting in the car or driving there. I just ended up in front of the crooked sign reading, Haven Shelter. The receptionist greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, handing me a clipboard to fill out. My pen hovered over the page as I questioned what I was even doing there. The shelter was chaotic, full of barking dogs and meowing cats. Most of the dogs pressed themselves against their cages, tails wagging eagerly as I walked by. But at the end of the row, there was one dog who didn't move. He just sat there, staring at me with eyes that seemed far too human. Jerry's been here a while, the shelter worker said, appearing beside me. Not a lot of people notice him. He's quiet. Quiet. That was the word. His short, scruffy coat was a mix of brown and black, his nose slightly speckled with white fur. But it was his eyes that caught me, big, round, and filled with something I couldn't name. Sadness? Understanding? Maybe both. I knelt down, reaching through the bars. Jerry didn't flinch or bark. He stepped forward cautiously, sniffing my hand before resting his nose against it. A warmth spread through me, the first I'd felt in months. "I'll take him," I said, surprising even myself. The ride home was strange. Jerry sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as if he were contemplating the meaning of life. I stole glances at him, wondering if I'd made a mistake. What if I couldn't take care of him? What if he needed more than I could give? But then he turned to me, his eyes meeting mine, and for a brief moment, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. When we got home, I opened the door and Jerry trotted in, his movements slow and deliberate. He sniffed everything: the couch, the rug, even Jack's chair. I watched as he sat by the chair. His head tilted slightly, as though he knew its significance. "That's Jack's spot," I murmured, my voice breaking. Jerry turned to look at me, his eyes soft as if to say, "I understand." That night, Jerry curled up at my feet as I sat in Jack's chair, a book open but unread in my lap. The house didn't feel so empty with him there. His quiet breathing filled the silence, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't cry myself to sleep. Instead, I drifted off with the faintest glimmer of hope, Jerry's warmth reminding me that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't entirely alone anymore. The days with Jerry started to settle into a quiet rhythm. He followed me everywhere, a constant shadow. In the kitchen, he sat patiently by the table while I sipped my coffee. On the couch, he curled up near my feet, his soft breathing a comforting backdrop to the silence of the house. There was something calming about his presence, steady, dependable, as though he'd always been there. Jerry wasn't a loud dog. He didn't bark much or demand attention, but his watchfulness made up for it. His big brown eyes tracked my every move, and sometimes when I caught his gaze, it felt like he understood me better than I understood myself. One morning as I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window, I felt a nudge at my knee. Jerry was there, his nose pressing against my leg. I smiled for what felt like the first time in weeks. "What is it, boy? You hungry?" His tail wagged faintly, and I reached down to scratch behind his ears. His fur was soft, his body warm, and for a moment I felt a flicker of something I hadn't in a long time connection. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pull me out of my fog. We started taking walks in the evenings. The fresh air helped clear my mind, and Jerry seemed to enjoy the change of scenery. He wasn't the type of dog to chase after squirrels or tug on the leash. He stayed close, his pace matching mine, his nose occasionally brushing against my hand as if to remind me he was there. One night, as we walked along the empty streets, I spoke to him. "You know, Jack always wanted a dog," I said. Jerry looked up at me, his ears perking slightly. "I always said no. I thought they were too much work. Guess I was wrong about that." Jerry tilted his head, and I laughed, a small tentative sound that surprised me. It felt good, like releasing a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. At home, Jerry found his favorite spots: the corner of the couch, the rug near the fireplace, and of course Jack's chair. I didn't mind sharing it with him. There was something fitting about it, as though he belonged there. As though he was meant to fill the empty spaces Jack had left behind. But there were moments when Jerry's behavior puzzled me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him sitting at the foot of my bed, staring at me. Or I'd step out of the shower to find him waiting just outside the bathroom door, his head tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "You keeping an eye on me, buddy?" I asked once, kneeling to scratch his ears. He didn't wag his tail or lean into my touch. He just stared, his gaze steady and unreadable. It unsettled me, but I brushed it off. He was just a dog, I told myself. Dogs are loyal. That's what they do. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jerry was more than he seemed. His quiet presence, his unblinking eyes, they felt almost intentional, like he was watching over me not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. One night, as I sat in Jack's chair with a book I wasn't really reading, Jerry climbed onto the rug and stretched out, his head resting on his paws. The firelight flickered across the room, casting soft shadows on the walls. I looked at him, his eyes half closed but still aware, and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't move, but his tail wagged once, softly like an acknowledgement. And in that moment I realized something. I wasn't just healing Jerry. He was healing me too. It started with little things. At first, I chalked it up to the quirks of living in an old house. A flicker of the lights here, a strange creak in the hallway there. Houses made noises, everyone knew that. But Jerry noticed it too. And that's what made me stop brushing it off. One evening, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard a low growl. I turned to find Jerry standing in the doorway, his body rigid, his ears pinned back. His eyes weren't on me but fixed on the hallway behind me. "What is it, Jerry?" I asked, my voice tentative. He didn't move, didn't even blink. I followed his gaze, my heart starting to pound. The hallway was empty, dark except for the faint glow of a nightlight plugged into the wall. The air felt colder, heavier, as though the house itself were holding its breath. "It's nothing," I muttered, trying to convince myself as much as him. But the unease lingered long after Jerry relaxed and padded back to his spot by the couch. The strange occurrences didn't stop. A few nights later, I was sitting in the living room when the sound of scratching interrupted the stillness. It was faint like nails on wood, coming from the wall behind the couch. I froze, listening intently. Jerry, who had been lying near my feet, lifted his head and growled softly. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He stood, his posture tense, his fur bristling as he moved toward the wall. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. My hands were trembling as I reached for my phone, its cold surface grounding me. I opened the flashlight app and pointed it at the wall, half expecting to see something there. Of course there was nothing. Just the house settling, I told myself. But the words felt hollow. As the days passed, Jerry's behavior became more protective, almost territorial. He followed me everywhere, his presence a constant shadow. At night, he refused to leave my bedroom, lying by the door as if guarding me from something. His growls were more frequent, low and guttural, directed at corners or darkened doorways. One night, I woke to find him standing at the foot of the bed, his body stiff, his eyes locked on the open doorway. The room felt unnaturally cold, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me. "Jerry?" I called softly. He didn't respond, his focus unbroken. My gaze followed his, but the doorway was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next day, I mentioned it to my therapist. "I think the house is, I don't know, weird," I said, avoiding her eyes. "Jerry keeps growling at nothing, and I hear these sounds, scratching footsteps. It's probably nothing, right?" She smiled, her tone soothing. "Grief can heighten your senses. It's not unusual to feel off in familiar places." Her words made sense, but they didn't ease the growing tension in my chest. The final straw came when I saw it, or thought I did. I was brushing my teeth late one night when movement in the mirror caught my attention. At first I thought it was Jerry, but when I turned he was lying in the doorway, his head on his paws. My eyes flicked back to the mirror, where I swore I saw a shadow, faint flickering, and gone in an instant. My breath caught in my throat, and I gripped the edge of the sink. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. "Get a grip, Emily," I muttered, shaking my head. But as I turned off the bathroom light and stepped into the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. Jerry was already up, his ears perked, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Let's go to bed," I whispered, and he followed, his tail low, his steps cautious. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, Jerry settling protectively at my feet. The house was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt wrong, as though it were waiting. And as I lay there, staring into the darkness, I realized I was waiting too. The air in the house felt heavier the next morning, as if it carried the weight of everything that had happened. I stood in the attic, dust motes swirling in the faint light streaming through a small, grimy window. My hands were trembling slightly as I opened an old box I'd found tucked behind a stack of forgotten furniture. Inside were papers, photographs, and yellowed letters. The scent of mildew wafted up, thick and sour. Most of the documents were mundane, utility bills, property deeds, but one photograph caught my eye. It showed a woman standing in front of the house. Her features were sharp, almost severe, with dark, piercing eyes and a tight smile that didn't quite reach them. Written on the back was a name, Vivian Mitchell. I turned the photo over again, studying her face. There was something unsettling about the way she held herself, as if she were guarding a secret. Underneath the photograph, I found a stack of letters addressed to someone named Margaret. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, and the tone of the letters became increasingly desperate as I read on. June 5, 1972. Dear Margaret, the house is restless again. I hear the scratching at night, the faint whispers in the walls. At first I thought it was my imagination, but now I am certain it knows I'm here. Sometimes I feel it watching me. I've tried to keep it contained, but it grows stronger with each passing day. Beware of what you bring into this place. It takes as much as it gives. The words sent a chill down my spine. I looked at Jerry, who sat by the attic stairs, his posture tense, his ears flicking as though he could hear something I couldn't. "What do you think, Jerry?" I asked softly, my voice shaky. He didn't move, his eyes fixed on the doorway behind me. I swallowed hard and put the letters back in the box, my hands brushing against something cold and metallic, a key. The key fit a small door in the basement, one I'd always assumed was just an old storage closet. My heart pounded as I turned the lock and pushed it open. The space inside was cramped, the walls lined with shelves cluttered with jars and dusty trinkets. In the center of the room was a small table, and on it sat an old, weathered book. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, the title too worn to read. Jerry let out a low growl, his body tense as he stood at the threshold, refusing to come inside. I reached out to touch the book, but the moment my fingers brushed its surface, a jolt of cold shot through me. Pulled back, my breath catching in my throat. The room felt wrong. The air was thick and suffocating, and the faint scent of decay lingered. I backed away, slamming the door shut and locking it. Jerry barked sharply, his growl growing louder as if urging me to leave. That night I couldn't sleep. The letters, the photograph, the book, they replayed in my mind on a loop. Who was Vivian Mitchell? What had she meant about the house being restless? And why did it feel like those words were meant for me? I sat in Jack's chair, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth, trying to make sense of it all. Jerry lay at my feet, his eyes darting to the shadows that flickered across the walls. "Do you feel it too?" I whispered. He let out a soft whine, his gaze steady on mine. The house creaked, a sound that had become all too familiar, and I felt that now familiar chill run down my spine. The scratching in the walls began again, louder this time, more deliberate. Jerry stood, his body rigid, and growled low in his throat. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. "It's just the house settling," I said aloud. But the words felt hollow. Deep down I knew there was something more. The letters, the photograph, the locked room, they weren't coincidences. The house had secrets, and whatever they weren't going to stay hidden for long. Jerry's behavior grew more unpredictable in the days that followed. He was no longer the calm, quiet dog I'd brought home from the shelter. Now his growls came often low and guttural, directed at corners or darkened doorways where nothing should have been. His movements became sharper, more deliberate, as if he were tracking something invisible. One evening, as I sat on the couch trying to distract myself with a book, Jerry's growl cut through the silence. My heart leaped, and I looked up to see him standing in the middle of the room, his body rigid, his ears pinned back. His eyes were locked on the hallway. "Jerry, what is it?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't respond, his focus unbroken. Slowly, he began to move toward the hallway, his steps cautious but determined. I followed, my chest tightening with each step. The air felt colder, heavier, as though the house itself were holding its breath. At the end of the hallway was the basement door. It was open. I knew I hadn't opened it. "Jerry, no," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But he was already descending the stairs, his growls growing louder with each step. I hesitated at the top, clutching the banister as fear rooted me in place. Finally, I forced myself to follow. The basement was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. Jerry stood in front of the small locked door I'd discovered days ago, his growls now a low, continuous rumble. The key was still in my pocket. I didn't want to use it, but something about the way Jerry stared at the door told me I had no choice. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room beyond was just as I remembered, cramped, lined with shelves filled with dusty jars and trinkets. But this time the atmosphere was different, felt alive, pulsing with an energy that made my skin crawl. In the center of the room, the old book still sat on the table, but now its cover was open, the pages fluttering as though caught in a wind that didn't exist. Jerry barked sharply, the sound echoing in the small space. His body was tense, his fur bristling, and his eyes darted between the book and the shadows that seemed to gather in the corners of the room. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The book's pages stopped moving, and the room fell eerily silent. I reached out, my hand shaking, and touched the edge of the book. The moment my fingers made contact, a jolt of cold shot through me, and a voice, low and raspy, whispered my name. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. Jerry barked again, his growls turning into snarls as he positioned himself between me and the book. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, growing darker, more oppressive. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The room fell silent again, and the darkness receded slightly. I grabbed the book, slammed it shut, and shoved it into the nearest shelf. Whatever was happening, I couldn't leave it out in the open. Jerry let out a low whine, his body relaxing slightly as he leaned against my leg. I knelt beside him, burying my face in his fur, my heart racing. "What is this, Jerry?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "What's happening to us?" He didn't answer, of course, but his presence was steady, grounding. He licked my hand, a small gesture that felt like reassurance, and for a moment the fear eased. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in Jack's chair, staring at the fire as it crackled in the hearth. Jerry lay at my feet, his eyes half closed but still watchful. The house was quiet, but the quiet felt wrong, like it was waiting for something. As I sat there, I thought about Jerry, about how he had changed since we came here. He wasn't just a dog. He was more than that. He saw things I couldn't, felt things I didn't. His protectiveness was more than loyalty. It was as if he knew something I didn't. Something about the house. Something about me. And then it hit me. Jerry wasn't just protecting me. He was protecting the house too, or maybe protecting me from it. Either way, the line between ally and adversary was becoming increasingly blurred. I looked down at him, his soft brown eyes meeting mine. "What are you, Jerry?" I whispered. He didn't answer, but his tail thumped softly against the floor as if to say, "You'll understand soon enough." The night was colder than usual, a biting chill that seeped into the walls and seemed to radiate from the floors. The fire in the living room sputtered, struggling to keep the shadows at bay. Jerry lay by my feet, his head resting on his paws, but his body was tense, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. Then I heard it, the scratching. Louder this time, insistent, as if whatever was behind the walls was trying to claw its way out. I froze, gripping the armrest of Jack's chair, my heart pounding in my chest. Jerry stood abruptly, his growl low and rumbling. His eyes were fixed on the hallway, his body rigid as he moved toward the sound. "Jerry," I whispered, but he didn't look back. He was already halfway to the hallway. The basement door was open again. I hadn't touched it since the last time, and the sight of it sent a jolt of fear through me. Jerry descended the stairs first, his growls growing louder with each step. I followed, clutching the flashlight I had grabbed from the kitchen. The basement was colder than ever, the air thick and oppressive. The small locked door at the far end of the room was wide open, the faint glow of candlelight flickering from within. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I shone it into the room. The book was back on the table, open to a page filled with strange symbols and writing I couldn't read. The air around it seemed to shimmer, distorting like heat waves. Jerry barked sharply, pulling my attention to the shadows in the corners of the room. They were moving, shifting, taking on forms that were almost human but not quite. My breath caught in my throat as one of them turned, its glowing red eyes locking onto mine. The presence was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that pressed down on me from all sides. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight, and fell to the floor. The light rolled across the room, casting erratic beams that only made the shadows seem more alive. Jerry was in front of me, his growls turning into ferocious snarls as he stood between me and the entity. His body was tense, his fur bristling, but he didn't move. He was protecting me, holding the line. I tried to breathe, tried to push myself to my feet, but the fear was paralyzing. The entity stepped closer, its form solidifying into a dark, humanoid shape with eyes that burned like embers. Its voice was low, raspy, and unnervingly calm. "Why do you fight it?" it whispered. "You hold on to the past, feeding me. Let it go, and I will leave." Its words hit me like a physical blow. Images of Jack flooded my mind. His laugh, his touch, the way he used to look at me like I was the only person in the world. I clung to those memories even though they hurt, even though they kept me trapped in the past. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "I can't." Jerry barked again, snapping me out of my spiraling thoughts. He turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine, and in that moment, I saw something I hadn't before. It wasn't just protectiveness. It was understanding. He knew what I was feeling, what I was going through. He had felt it too. I reached out, my hand brushing against his fur. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm sorry I've held on for so long. I'm sorry I've let this take over my life." The entity recoiled slightly, as if my words had weakened it. The air grew lighter, the pressure easing. Jerry barked once more, and the entity let out a low growl of its own before retreating into the shadows. I stood slowly, my legs trembling, and moved toward the book. It no longer shimmered or pulsed with energy. It was just an old, worn thing. I grabbed it, my hand steady now, and slammed it shut. The sound echoed through the room, and the shadows disappeared completely. The house was quiet as I climbed the stairs, Jerry at my side. I locked the basement door and leaned against it, letting out a long, shaky breath. The weight in my chest was still there, but it felt different, lighter, less suffocating. Jerry pressed against my leg, his tail wagging softly. I knelt beside him, burying my face in his fur. "Thank you," I whispered, "for staying with me. For everything." That night, as I lay in bed with Jerry curled up beside me, I didn't feel afraid. The house was still, the air warm. For the first time in a long time I felt at peace. And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized that letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant making room for something new. For hope, for healing, for the possibility of moving forward. Morning came gently, with sunlight streaming through the window and filling the room with a golden warmth. The house was still and quiet, not the oppressive silence I'd grown used to, but a peaceful hush that felt like a fresh start. I stretched, feeling a soreness in my chest that wasn't fear or grief, but something closer to relief. Jerry lay beside the bed, his body relaxed, his tail wagging lazily when he saw I was awake. His brown eyes met mine and I smiled, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. "Good morning, boy," I murmured, my voice soft. "We did it, didn't we?" Jerry let out a low huff, his version of a contented sigh, and rested his head on my lap. I sat there for a moment, running my fingers through his fur, feeling the weight of the previous night lift further with every breath. The rest of the day passed quietly. I gathered the letters and photographs I'd found in the attic and placed them in a box. They didn't scare me anymore. They were just remnants of another time, another life. I decided I'd take them to the town archives, where they might be preserved or studied. They didn't belong to me, and I didn't need to carry them anymore. Jerry followed me from room to room, his presence a constant comfort. The house felt lighter now, less like a tomb and more like a place where something new could begin. I spent the afternoon on the phone with a real estate agent. "I'd like to list my house," I said, the words flowing more easily than I expected. I'd held on to this place because it was where Jack and I had built our life together. But I realized now that holding on to the house wasn't holding on to him. It was just keeping me trapped. "I'll have someone come by for an appraisal," the agent said, her voice brisk but kind. "You're making a good decision." I hung up and stared at the phone for a moment, feeling the finality of my choice. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. Felt like freedom. That evening, I took Jerry for a walk in the park. The crisp air smelled of leaves and earth, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. We walked along the familiar paths, Jerry sniffing at the ground and occasionally glancing up at me as if to check that I was okay. "You know, Jack would have liked you," I said, my voice light. Jerry tilted his head, his ears perking up. He always wanted a dog. I guess it just took me a little longer to realize why. I laughed softly, and for the first time, the memory of Jack didn't bring tears. It brought warmth. That night, I sat in front of the fireplace, Jerry curled up beside me. I thought about Jack, about the love we'd shared and the life we'd built. I thought about the grief that had consumed me, and the way it had kept me chained to the past. Letting go didn't mean forgetting him. It didn't mean erasing the pain. It meant making room for something new, for a future I wasn't afraid of anymore. As the fire crackled and cast dancing shadows across the walls, I whispered a quiet goodbye to Jack. Not a final goodbye, but one that made space for healing. Jerry shifted closer, his warmth grounding me, his presence a reminder that I wasn't alone. The house would soon belong to someone else. The memories would always be mine, but the weight of them didn't have to hold me down anymore. When I went to bed that night, the air in the house felt different. The shadows weren't heavy. The silence wasn't oppressive. Jerry lay at the foot of the bed, his soft breathing a comforting rhythm as I drifted off to sleep. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for whatever came next.